It was a Wednesday night in early fall, and the city outside Julie's apartment was drenched in a cold drizzle. The flickering streetlights cast shadows on the walls, and the faint hum of a late-night sitcom played in the background. Julie sat curled up on her couch, scrolling mindlessly through her phone, savoring the quiet after a long day. She didn't expect her evening to take a dramatic turn. At exactly 10:47 p.m., a knock at her door broke the silence. It wasn't the polite, tentative knock of a neighbor borrowing sugar. It was urgent, insistent, and relentless. Julie froze, her mind racing. Late-night visitors were rare, and her instincts told her to ignore it. But the knocking didn't stop. Cautiously, she approached the door, peeking through the peephole. There stood Nate, her neighbor from across the hall. His usually groomed appearance was nowhere to be seen. His shirt was wrinkled, one sleeve slightly rolled up, and his hair looked like he'd run his hands through it 100 times. His eyes were wild, too wild to IG Julie, he said, his voice muffled through the door. "Please, can I come in?" "What's going on?" she asked, her fingers gripping. "I just need a place to sit for a minute," he said. "Tara and I—" His voice broke off and he looked down. "I can't go back there right now." Julie hesitated. She didn't know Nate well beyond the occasional polite exchange in the hallway. Tara, his wife, was the kind of woman who turned heads, polished, confident, and a little intimidating. But Julie had seen cracks in their seemingly perfect facade. Late-night arguments that spilled into the hallway. A shattered vase once dragged out with the trash. Still, letting him in felt against her better judgment. She opened the door. Nate stepped inside, his tall frame dominating the small space. He looked around briefly, his eyes darting to the messy stack of magazines on the coffee table and the half-eaten bowl of popcorn on the counter. "Thanks," he muttered, sinking into her couch. Julie closed the door, watching him carefully. "Do you want to talk about it?" He let out a bitter laugh, rubbing his hands over his face. "Tara and I had another fight. This one was bad. She said some things, I said some things. I just needed to get out before it got worse." Julie nodded, unsure of what to say. "Do you want something to drink? Water? Tea? Whiskey if you've got it?" he replied with a weak smile. She hesitated but decided it wasn't the night for judgment. Pouring 2 glasses of whiskey, she handed him one and sat down across from him. "Thanks," he said again, taking a long sip. As they talked, Julie found herself softening. Nate's tough exterior cracked, revealing a man who was deeply troubled, but also undeniably magnetic. His voice, low and gravelly, drew her in, and his occasional smiles felt like stolen moments of warmth in the storm. An hour later, the mood had shifted. The whiskey loosened their tongues, and their conversation turned personal. Too personal. Nate confessed that his marriage to Tara had been rocky for years, and Julie shared bits of her own disappointments, her struggles with loneliness, her failed attempts at relationships. It was when their eyes met, lingering a second too long, that the air between them thickened. "You're different, you know," Nate said softly, leaning forward. "Tara's always performing, but you're real." Julie's breath caught. "Nate!" Before she could finish, he was closer. The world outside faded. The rain, the city, the ticking clock on the wall. All that existed was the heat of the moment. The way his hand brushed hers. The way their lips collided in a burst of reckless passion. It was electric, impulsive, and utterly consuming. The next morning, Julie woke to an empty apartment. The events of the night before felt surreal, like a vivid dream. But the faint scent of Nate's cologne lingering on her sheets was a stark reminder that it was real. As she made her coffee, the weight of her choices settled in. She knew Nate and Tara's marriage was complicated, but what they'd done crossed a line she couldn't take back. Her thoughts were interrupted by a loud banging on her door. Her heart sank. She opened it to find Tara standing there, her face a storm of fury. "You?" Tara spat, shoving her way into the apartment. "You think I wouldn't find out?" Julie's stomach dropped. "Tara, I don't, Tara interrupted, her voice trembling with rage. I know. Nate told me everything. Julie's pulse quickened. She could barely process Tara's words before the woman began pacing the room, her anger erupting in waves. You think you can just play the sympathetic neighbor and steal my husband? Tara snapped, her eyes glinting with malice. It's not what you think, Julie stammered, though she wasn't sure she believed her own words. Oh, it's exactly what I think, Tara sneered. And let me tell you something, Julie. You've made a very big mistake. Her tone sent a chill down Julie's spine. This wasn't just anger, it was a promise of vengeance. The day spiraled into chaos. Tara left Julie's apartment, but her threats hung in the air. That afternoon, Julie's boss called her into the office, his expression unreadable. I've received a troubling email, he said, sliding a printed message across the desk. Julie's blood ran cold as she read the words. It was an anonymous tip detailing Julie's inappropriate relationship with a married man. The implication was clear. Her personal life was now under a microscope. And it didn't stop there. By the evening, Julie found her social media accounts flooded with cryptic messages and veiled accusations. Someone, Tara, no doubt, was trying to dismantle her life piece by piece. As Julie sat in her darkened apartment, her phone buzzed with a message. She almost didn't look, but curiosity got the better of her. The message was from Nate. I'm sorry. I'll fix this. Meet me tonight. Rooftop. 10 p.m. Her heart raced. She didn't know if she could trust him, or if meeting him would only pull her deeper into the whirlwind. But she didn't have time to decide. A sudden crash from her bedroom made her jump. She wasn't alone. Julie's heart raced as she grabbed the nearest object, a heavy candle holder, and crept toward her bedroom. The door was ajar, and the faintest sound of movement drifted out. She held her breath, every nerve on edge, as she peeked inside. The room was dark except for the dim glow of the city lights filtering through the window. A figure stood near her dresser, rifling through her belongings. Who's there? She demanded, her voice trembling but firm. The intruder froze, then turned slowly. It wasn't Tara or Nate. It was a man she didn't recognize, tall, wiry, with a thin face shadowed by a hoodie. His eyes gleamed with a predatory intensity. Easy, he said, holding up his hands. I'm just looking for Nate. Julie's grip tightened on the candle holder. How did you get in here? And why are you looking for Nate? The man smirked, taking a step toward her. Let's just say he owes someone, and I'm here to collect. Julie's mind raced. She didn't know whether to scream, run, or fight. I don't know where Nate is, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. And you need to leave. Now. The man took another step, his smirk widening. I'm not leaving without answers. You're involved with him, aren't you? Don't bother lying. I can see it all over your face. The accusation hit like a slap. Julie's shame mingled with fear, but she refused to let him see it. Get out, she said again, her voice rising. The man's gaze flicked to her phone on the nightstand. You've got his number. Call him. Julie hesitated, unsure of what to do. If she called Nate, it would drag her deeper into whatever trouble he was in. But if she didn't, the man reached for her phone, and she reacted on instinct. Swinging the candle holder with all her strength, she caught him on the side of the head. He staggered back, cursing. Julie seized the opportunity, bolting for the door. She didn't stop running until she was out of her apartment and pounding on her neighbor's door 2 floors down. The police arrived quickly. Julie recounted the incident, though she left out the parts about Nate and their affair. The officers searched her apartment, but the man was gone, leaving no trace behind. That's unsettling, one officer said as he made notes in his pad. Any idea who he could have been? Julie shook her head. No, he just mentioned Nate's name. My neighbor from across the hall. The officer exchanged a glance with his partner. We'll look into it. If he comes back, call us immediately. After the police left, Julie locked her doors and windows, her hands still shaking. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of fear, guilt, and anger. Who was this man? What did Nate get himself into? Her phone buzzed. It was another message from Nate. "Where are you?" "Rooftop. We need to talk." Against her better judgment, she decided to meet him. The rooftop of their apartment complex was quiet, bathed in the cold glow of the city's lights. Nate was leaning against the railing, his silhouette tense and unsteady. When he saw her, he straightened. "Julie, are you okay? You look pale." She marched up to him, her fear transforming into fury. "Am I okay?" "No, Nate. I'm not okay. Some guy broke into my apartment looking for you." His expression darkened. "What? Who? You tell me," she snapped. "Who did you piss off this time?" Nate ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Tara's been using my name in her schemes, borrowing money, making deals she can't keep. I think one of her business partners decided to pay a visit." Julie's jaw dropped. "Tara? Are you serious? Why didn't you warn me?" "I didn't think they'd come after you," he said, his voice tinged with guilt. "I didn't think any of this would spiral out of control." Julie laughed bitterly. "Well, it has. And now I'm caught in the middle of your mess. Thanks for that." Nate stepped closer, his expression earnest. "I'll fix this, Julie. I promise." "How?" she demanded. "What are you going to do?" Before he could answer, the rooftop door burst open. Tara stormed in, her face a mix of rage and triumph. "Of course," she sneered, her gaze darting between them. "I should have known I'd find you two here, cozying up while the rest of us clean up your mess." "Nate, this isn't the time, Tara," Nate said, his tone weary. "Oh, it's exactly the time," she shot back. "Do you even know what you've done? What you've dragged us into?" Julie watched as Nate's composure began to crack. "You mean what you dragged me into?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Don't act like you're innocent in all this." Tara stepped closer, her fury simmering just below the surface. "Don't turn this on me, Nate. You're the one who ran to her the second things got tough." Julie wanted to disappear. She could feel Tara's venomous gaze on her. But before she could speak, Nate's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his face going pale. "What is it?" Julie asked. Nate swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "They took her." "Who?" Tara demanded. Nate turned to her, his expression grim. "Your sister. They've got her, and they want me to trade myself for her." The revelation hit like a freight train, leaving them all reeling. Tara's fury melted into shock, while Julie tried to make sense of it all. Who were these people and how far were they willing to go? As the three stood on the rooftop, the city's lights blinking in the distance, one thing became clear. They were all in over their heads, and there was no way out without risking everything. The night wasn't over, it was only beginning. The rooftop seemed to close in on us, the cool city air suddenly too sharp, too suffocating. Nate's words hung in the air, heavy and horrifying. "They took her." Tara's face twisted with disbelief. "My sister? They took Cassie? Who? Who are these people?" Nate ran a hand through his hair, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. "It's the same guys, Tara," he snapped. "The ones who've been after me ever since your little business deals fell apart." Tara's fury reignited. "My business deals? Oh, give me a break, Nate. You were happy enough to ride the wave when things were good. Don't you dare act like you're innocent." Julie stood frozen, watching the scene unfold. The world she'd stepped into when she let Nate into her apartment was spiraling further and further out of control. "Stop it," she said finally, her voice sharper than she intended. Both of them turned to look at her. "Fighting isn't going to fix anything. If Cassie's in danger, we need to figure out what to do." Tara let out a bitter laugh. "And what do you suggest, Julie? You think you can play the hero now, after cozying up with my husband?" Julie flinched but held her ground. "Look, I'm not proud of what happened, but right now this isn't about me or you. It's about saving your sister. Tara opened her mouth to retort but closed it again, her anger giving way to the grim reality of the situation. Do they want money? Julie asked Nate. He shook his head. Not this time. They want me. They said if I don't show up by midnight, they'll... He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Tara's hands trembled as she crossed her arms. We need to call the police. No, Nate said immediately. What do you mean, no? Tara shot back. They have Cassie. We're not equipped to handle this. And you think the cops are? Nate countered. These guys aren't amateurs, Tara. If they so much as think we've involved the authorities, Cassie's as good as dead. Julie felt a shiver run down her spine. Then what's the plan? Nate hesitated, glancing between the two women. I'll go. I'll meet them. Tara's eyes widened. Are you insane? You can't just hand yourself over to them. You got a better idea? He shot back. Because I don't see one. Julie's mind raced. What if we turn the tables? Both of them looked at her, confused. What if we go in prepared? She continued. If we can find out where they're keeping Cassie, maybe we can get her out before they know what's happening. That's suicide, Nate said flatly. So is walking into their hands without a plan, Julie argued. You're not thinking straight, Nate. They're not going to just let you go. And if they kill you, who's going to help Cassie? Nate stared at her for a long moment, and for the first time that night, Julie thought she saw a glimmer of hope in his eyes. It didn't take long to figure out their first move. Nate had been sent a location, a rundown warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Tara insisted on coming along, despite Nate's protests, and Julie had no intention of staying behind. By the time they reached the warehouse, it was nearly midnight. The area was eerily quiet, the surrounding streets deserted. This is it, Nate said, parking the car a block away. Julie glanced at him. What's the plan? He didn't answer right away. You two stay here, he said finally. No way, Tara said. You're not walking in there alone. It's not up for debate, Nate snapped. I've already dragged you both into enough. If anything happens... Stop it, Julie interrupted. We're not leaving you to face this alone. We either do this together or not at all. Nate sighed, his resolve weakening. Fine, but stay behind me. And if anything goes wrong, you get out of here. No arguments. The warehouse was dark, its windows boarded up and its walls covered in graffiti. As they approached, the faint sound of voices reached their ears. They're in there, Nate whispered. Julie's pulse quickened as they crept closer. Through a crack in the door, they saw two men standing near a makeshift table. One of them had a gun tucked into his waistband. She's not here, Nate murmured, his jaw tightening. Maybe she's in the back, Julie suggested. Tara's breathing was shallow, her eyes darting around nervously. What if this is a trap? Before anyone could answer, the door creaked open. Looking for someone? A deep voice asked. The man from Julie's apartment stepped into view, his smirk as chilling as she remembered. You've got guts showing up here, he said, his eyes narrowing at Nate. But I'll give you credit for that. Where is she? Nate demanded. The man chuckled, shaking his head. Not so fast. Let's see if you brought what we need first. Tara stepped forward, her voice trembling. What do you want? Money? Whatever it is, we'll give it to you. Just let Cassie go. The man's expression darkened. This isn't about money, sweetheart. This is about sending a message. Your husband here, he thought he could play games with us. Now we're just evening the score. Julie's blood ran cold as the man signaled to his companion. Moments later, Cassie was dragged into view, her hands tied and her face pale but defiant. Cassie! Tara cried, rushing forward. The man said, blocking her path. Not so fast. Julie's mind raced as she tried to think of a way out. And then she saw it. A loose metal pipe lying near the wall. She locked eyes with Nate, who gave her the faintest of nods. Let her go, Nate said, stepping forward. You've got me. That's what you wanted, right? The man grinned. Now you're getting it. Julie moved quickly, grabbing the pipe and swinging it at the second man. The sound of metal meeting flesh echoed through the warehouse as he crumpled to the ground. Run! Nate shouted as chaos erupted. What followed was a blur of shouts, scuffles, and the deafening crack of a gunshot. Julie didn't stop running until they were back in the car, Cassie crammed into the back seat and Tara sobbing uncontrollably. As they sped away, Julie glanced at Nate, who was clutching his arm, blood seeping through his shirt. "This isn't over," he said grimly. "Not by a long shot." Julie swallowed hard, realizing he was right. The danger wasn't behind them, it was just beginning. The car sped through the deserted streets, the air inside thick with tension. Tara sat in the back, holding Cassie's trembling hands, while Nate pressed a bloodied cloth against his arm. Julie kept her eyes on the road, but her mind was spinning. "That gunshot," she said finally, her voice breaking the silence. "Are they going to come after us?" Nate let out a shaky breath. "They won't stop now. Not after what we pulled." Tara's voice cracked as she spoke. "You should have let me call the police. This is insane. What kind of life are we living where these things happen?" Nate turned to face her, his expression hard. "The life you dragged us into, Tara. Or have you forgotten your little schemes?" "Stop it," Cassie shouted, her voice cutting through the argument like a knife. "You're both acting like kids. None of this matters if we don't figure out what to do next." Julie shot a glance at her in the rearview mirror, surprised by her composure despite everything she'd endured. Cassie, it seemed, had an inner strength neither Tara nor Nate fully understood. "We can't go back to the apartment," Julie said. "They know where we live. We need somewhere safe." "I have a friend," Cassie offered. "An old college roommate. She lives outside the city, completely off the radar. We can hide there, at least for a little while." Julie hesitated. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than nothing. "Text her," she said. "Tell her we're coming." 2 hours later, they pulled into the driveway of a small cabin nestled deep in the woods. The porch light flickered on as a woman stepped outside, her face a mixture of relief and concern. "Cassie!" she called, rushing forward to embrace her friend. "Thanks, Lila," Cassie said, her voice wavering. "I didn't know where else to go." Lila glanced at the rest of them, her eyes narrowing as she took in Nate's injury and Tara's tear-streaked face. "We've got a lot to talk about, don't we?" Inside, the cabin was warm and inviting, its rustic charm a stark contrast to the chaos they just escaped. Lila wasted no time gathering first aid supplies to tend to Nate's wound. "This needs stitches," she said, dabbing antiseptic on the gash. "You should really see a doctor." "Not an option," Nate muttered, wincing as she worked. Julie watched silently, her hands trembling as the adrenaline began to wear off. Everything felt surreal, the warehouse, the escape, the danger still looming over them. Lila sat back, crossing her arms. "Cassie told me the basics, but I need the full story. What's going on?" Nate glanced at Tara, then at Julie. Finally, he sighed. "We're in trouble. Big trouble. The men who took Cassie, they work for a loan shark named Victor. Tara, she borrowed money from him using my name. When she couldn't pay it back, they came after me." Lila's eyes narrowed. "And now they're after all of you." "Pretty much," Nate said. "What's their end game?" Lila asked. "To make an example out of me," Nate replied grimly. "Victor doesn't like loose ends." As the hours stretched on, they began to form a plan. Hiding forever wasn't an option, and going to the police carried its own risks. The only way to end the nightmare was to confront Victor directly. But that was easier said than done. "I know where his main operation is," Nate admitted, his tone reluctant. "An old nightclub downtown, but it's heavily guarded. We'd never get close to him." Julie frowned, her mind racing. "What if we lure him out? Create a distraction? And then what?" Tara asked. We can't exactly take on a crime lord. No, but we can gather evidence, Julie countered. Something that will force the authorities to take him down. Nate hesitated. It's risky. It's the only option we have, Julie said firmly. The next evening, they put their plan into motion. Lila stayed behind at the cabin with Cassie, while Julie, Nate, and Tara returned to the city. Their target was the nightclub, a gaudy, neon-lit fortress where Victor conducted most of his business. Julie's role was simple but dangerous. She would pose as a potential informant, drawing Victor's attention while Nate and Tara planted a recording device in his office. Her heart raced as she entered the club, the bass of the music vibrating through the floor. The crowd was dense, but her focus was on the man seated in the VIP section, a burly figure with a shaved head and a cold, calculating gaze. Victor. Taking a deep breath, Julie approached him. "Mr. Victor?" she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. He looked up, his eyes narrowing. "Who's asking?" "My name's Julie," she said, forcing a smile. "I have information you might find interesting." Meanwhile, Nate and Tara slipped into the back offices, navigating the labyrinth of hallways with cautious precision. Tara kept watch while Nate planted the recording device, his hands shaking as he secured it beneath Victor's desk. "Hurry up," Tara whispered, her eyes darting nervously. "I'm almost done," Nate replied. But just as he finished, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. Back in the club, Victor leaned closer to Julie, his expression skeptical. "You've got 10 seconds to convince me you're not wasting my time." Julie swallowed hard, her mind scrambling for something to say. "I know about Nate," she blurted. "I know he's been working against you." Victor's eyes darkened. "Go on." Before she could continue, a commotion erupted from the back of the club. Victor stood abruptly, barking orders to his men. Julie's stomach dropped. Something's gone wrong. In the chaos that followed, Julie found herself being dragged toward the back rooms. She caught a glimpse of Nate and Tara being shoved into a dimly lit office, their faces pale and panicked. Victor entered behind them, his demeanor ice-cold. "Looks like we've got a family reunion," he said, his tone dripping with menace. Julie's heart sank. Their plan had failed, and now they were at Victor's mercy. "Let's see how much you're all willing to lose," he added, pulling a sleek knife from his pocket and twirling it ominously. The nightmare wasn't over, it had only just begun. The air in Victor's office was suffocating. Julie's pulse pounded in her ears as Victor paced in front of them, the glint of the knife catching the dim light. Tara clung to Nate's arm, her face a mixture of terror and guilt. Nate, bleeding from the reopened wound on his arm, kept his jaw tight, his eyes locked on Victor. "Did you really think you could outsmart me?" Victor said, his voice cold and deliberate. "You, of all people, Nate? The man who let his wife dig a hole so deep. Even I started feeling sorry for him." Tara flinched but said nothing. Victor stopped, fixing Julie with a predatory stare. "And you? What's your angle, sweetheart? Playing the hero for this sorry lot? Or just another pawn in Nate's pathetic little game?" Julie's throat tightened, but she refused to show fear. "I'm not here for games," she said, her voice steady. "I'm here to make a deal." Victor raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "A deal? You're not really in a position to negotiate." "You'd be surprised," Julie countered, holding his gaze. The next few minutes were a blur of tense negotiations. Julie revealed what she and Nate had done, confessing to planting the recording device. She didn't tell him it was already transmitting audio to a remote server. Victor didn't need to know that. "What do you want?" Victor asked finally, his voice dripping with skepticism. "Freedom," Julie said. "Let us go. No more threats, no more chasing us down. And in return, we'll make sure the recording stays hidden." Victor chuckled, the sound low and menacing. "You're bold. I'll give you that. But what makes you think I don't have other ways to deal with you?" Julie's heart pounded, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Because you're smarter than that," she said. You know what happens if something happens to us. The recording gets out, and your entire operation goes down. Victor stared at her for a long moment, his dark eyes narrowing. I like you, he said finally, a sly grin spreading across his face. You've got guts. Stupid, reckless guts, but guts all the same. He turned to his men. Let them go. For now. Julie didn't exhale until they were outside, the cold night air hitting her like a wave. Tara stumbled against Nate, tears streaming down her face, while Nate wrapped a protective arm around her. Julie pulled out her phone and sent a single message to the contact managing the recording server. It's done. We're free, she said, her voice shaking. But Nate shook his head. Not yet. What do you mean? Tara asked, her voice raw. They're going to come after us, Nate said grimly. Victor doesn't let loose ends walk away, no matter what deals he makes. Julie's stomach sank. So what do we do? Nate's expression hardened. We fight back. We take the recording public, expose everything. It's the only way to end this for good. Tara looked horrified. Are you crazy? Do you know what Victor will do to us if we betray him? Nate's gaze softened as he looked at her. Do you know what he'll do if we don't? The next 48 hours were a blur of frantic planning. Using the recording they'd captured, Julie and Nate worked with Lila to build a case against Victor. They contacted a journalist willing to publish the story, someone who had a reputation for taking on dangerous figures. Tara, terrified of Victor's retaliation, begged Nate to reconsider. We can disappear, she pleaded. Change our names, start over. We don't have to do this. But Nate's resolve was unshakable. We'll never truly be free if we run, he said. Julie watched the exchange, torn between sympathy for Tara and admiration for Nate's determination. On the day the story went live, the world changed in an instant. The recording exposed Victor's network of illegal activities, money laundering, extortion, and worse. The story spread like wildfire, and within hours, law enforcement descended on Victor's nightclub. But with the victory came consequences. That night, as Julie sat in her apartment packing her belongings, her phone buzzed with a message. Unknown number. You think this is over? Watch your back. Her hands shook as she showed the message to Nate, who was helping her pack. They'll come for us, she said. I know, he replied quietly. The fallout was swift and brutal. Victor's empire crumbled, but not before his loyalists scattered, vowing revenge. Julie, Nate, and Tara were forced into witness protection, their lives uprooted yet again. For months, they lived in anonymity, always looking over their shoulders. The weight of what they'd done hung over them like a shadow, a constant reminder of the price they'd paid for their freedom. 1 year later, Julie found herself in a quiet coastal town, working at a small cafe under a new name. She hadn't seen Nate or Tara since they'd been relocated, but she thought of them often. One evening, as she closed up the cafe, a familiar figure appeared in the doorway. It was Nate. I found you, he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Julie's heart skipped a beat. What are you doing here? He stepped closer, his expression earnest. I couldn't stay away. Not after everything. She hesitated, memories of their tangled past rushing back. And Tara? Nate's smile faded. We've gone our separate ways. She couldn't handle the life we've been forced into. Julie's chest tightened. So what now? Nate reached for her hand, his touch warm and familiar. We start over. Together. For the first time in months, Julie allowed herself to hope. The road ahead would be uncertain, but in Nate's eyes, she saw the promise of a new beginning. And for the first time since that fateful knock on her door, she dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find peace.